In the golden towers of Constantinople, where imperial power was passed under the blessing of Christ Pantocrator, one of the most disturbing tragedies in Byzantine history was born. This is not a story of conquests or military glory, but of a sacred bond turned into a chain of horror. Prince Alexandro Ducas, heir to the most powerful throne in the East, seemed destined to embody the perfection of Byzantium, beauty, wisdom, and nobility. But behind the golden mosaics and the domes of Hagia Sophia, his own blood would condemn him to a life marked by the most unthinkable betrayal, that of a father against his son. What you are about to hear does not appear in official books. Because it reveals how far the corruption of power can go when mixed with obsession and fear. And also, how lost honor can transform into a force so destructive that it would change the fate of an empire. Before continuing, subscribe and turn on notifications, because on this channel you will discover hidden stories that no one else dares to tell. The year is 1071. Constantinople, the New Rome, shines as the most precious jewel of the medieval world. From the imposing Theodosian walls, capable of withstanding any siege, to the golden eagles of the Great Palace, the city is the beating heart between East and West. The majestic domes of Hagia Sophia seem to touch the sky, reminding every inhabitant that this was no ordinary city, but the one chosen by God to govern Eastern Christendom. The Bosphorus, that blue vein connecting seas and continents, carried riches to its docks from all over the known world, spices from India, silks from China, gold from Egypt, horses from the steppes. In the streets, the bustle was constant. Arab merchants negotiated with Greek traders, Western diplomats mingled with Orthodox monks, and along the marble-paved avenues paraded imperial processions reminding all that Byzantium was still the center of the political and spiritual universe. But, as with all jewels, beneath the shine were invisible cracks. The empire was surrounded by enemies, the Seljuk Turks advanced from the east, the Normans threatened from the west, and within the walls, the aristocracy played their own power games. Constantinople was splendid, yes, but also a palace of mirrors where the light hid the darkest shadows. At the heart of the great palace ruled Constantine X Ducas, an emperor whose figure was marked by paradox, venerated as a defender of the Orthodox faith, yet feared for his erratic character and growing paranoia. Constantine had inherited an empire harassed by external enemies and weakened by internal struggles. Years of military and political pressures had turned him into a distrustful man, capable of sudden outbursts of violence followed by almost theatrical pleas for mercy. Byzantine chroniclers describe him as a brilliant ruler at times, but deeply unstable, as if his crown weighed more than the marble of the throne on which he sat. The death of Empress Eudoxia Macrembolitissa, his wife, 3 years earlier, only exacerbated that instability. Officially she had died of fever, but in the palace corridors another fate was whispered, poisoning, perhaps, for having discovered secrets too dangerous about her husband. Eudoxia had been the mediator between father and sons, the protective shield that kept the family core united. With her absence, the invisible walls that protected Prince Alexandro collapsed. The great palace, with its golden mosaics and solemn ceremonies, hid beneath its surface an atmosphere poisoned by intrigue. Every word was measured, every gesture had political value, and the relationship between Constantine and his eldest son began to veer into dangerous territory. In a cosmos where the sacred intertwined with the political, the emperor's authority merged with a personal power that recognized no limits. Prince Alexandro Ducas was, in the eyes of Byzantium, the embodiment of the ideal heir. The firstborn son of Constantine X, his upbringing had been carefully designed to mold him into the ideal ruler. From an early age, he was instructed by the empire's brightest scholars. John Mauropus taught him rhetoric, Michael Psellos introduced him to philosophy, and General Nicephorus Botaniates trained him in the military arts. By the age of 18, Alexandro mastered classical Greek, ecclesiastical Latin, Orthodox theology, and war tactics. He was a prince who could quote Aristotle in a philosophical debate in the morning and lead a formation of soldiers by nightfall. Intellectual perfection was paired with a beauty that the court could not stop admiring, golden hair like the domes of Hagia Sophia, green eyes like the marbles of Thessalonica, and a bearing that seemed carved in gold and glass mosaic. Foreign chroniclers were no less generous in their praise. The Norman Robert Guiscard described him as a young man with the wisdom of Solomon and the beauty of Absalom. Arab ambassadors compared him to the princes of 1001 Nights. Even within the Byzantine aristocracy, so accustomed to splendor, Alexandro shone as if Justinian's mosaics had come to life. He appeared to be the savior the empire needed. Intelligent, cultured, strong, and the legitimate heir of the Ducas dynasty. Everything seemed poised for him to restore the glory of Byzantium, but the higher his figure rose on the Constantinople horizon, the more the shadows awakened in the heart of the man who had fathered him. After the death of Empress Eudoxia, the Byzantine court lost its moderating voice. She had been the bridge between the emperor and his children, the only one able to temper Constantine X's outbursts. Without her presence, the family balance broke, and the father-son relationship took an increasingly troubling course. At first, they were small changes in protocol. The emperor began demanding Alexander's presence at private audiences outside the traditional ceremonial occasions. He summoned him at unusual hours, behind closed doors, without the usual supervision of eunuchs or palace notaries. What should have been a formal, institutional contact began to turn into encounters charged with a strange, almost unnatural air. The cubicularii, the guardians of access to the imperial chambers, were the first to notice something disturbing. The meetings between father and son would stretch on for hours, always without witnesses. The routine became so irregular that even the closest advisors, such as Michael Sellos, began recording in their writings veiled hints that something was not right. The effect on Alexander became visible quickly. The young prince, once radiant and self-assured, began showing signs of deep distress. He lost weight in just a few weeks, his skin became pale, and at public receptions his hands trembled whenever his father's name was mentioned. His green eyes, which poets had compared to emeralds, now seemed dull, heavy with an inexplicable pain. Beneath the glittering surface of the great palace, where marble and gold symbolized the eternity of the empire, a dangerous shadow was germinating. A darkness that did not come from external invaders or aristocratic conspirators, but from the very heart of the imperial family. Chroniclers of the time, limited by censorship, religion, and fear of offending the dynasty, left their testimonies in coded language, full of metaphors and silences. But reading between the lines reveals a sinister pattern. Emperor Constantine had transformed his paternal role into an exercise of sickening and degrading control. The philosopher Michael Sellos noted in his private writings that Constantine displayed a disturbing obsession with his son's purity and body. Official Juan Cantacuzene was even more explicit in secret memoirs discovered centuries later. He spoke of forced inspections and private rituals that went beyond any medical, military, or religious justification. The sessions were always held behind closed doors, in a room specially prepared within the palace. What was officially presented as paternal supervision was, in reality, an invasion of the prince's dignity, an absolute power that transcended human and sacred limits. The impact on Alexander was devastating. The heir who had amazed with his intelligence and charm slowly dimmed. Those who knew him closely began noticing a radical transformation, withdrawal, a vacant stare, and a heavy silence that replaced his former eloquence. The young man trained to lead armies and debate with scholars now seemed a shadow, carrying an invisible weight. Byzantium was accustomed to conspiracies, betrayals, and regicides. But what was happening within the walls of the great palace was different. It was not about politics or external ambitions, but intimate degradation, a corruption reaching the marrow of the imperial institution. Absolute power had turned the sacred figure of the emperor into the worst executioner of his own son. Alexander's transformation was impossible to hide. Courtiers who had seen him shine as an exemplary prince began whispering that something terrible had occurred. The young man who once recited Homer in a firm voice and trained with the Varangian Guard now walked hunched, avoided gazes, and barely spoke in public. His interest in theology, once a pillar of his education, disappeared abruptly. Instead of attending orthodox studies with the monks, he spent hours in the imperial library, seeking obscure texts on divine justice, exemplary punishments, and vengeance. The cultured and refined prince was becoming a shadowy young man, consumed by thoughts of retaliation. Even in military training, his instructors noticed an alarming change. He no longer practiced martial arts with serene discipline, but with a self-destructive ferocity. He struck his fellow soldiers with fury, threw himself into extreme exercises until collapse, as if trying to let physical pain extinguish a much deeper one. The most revealing moment occurred in January 1073, during the ceremony of Theophany, one of the Orthodox Church's most sacred rituals. In the middle of the ceremony, when Emperor Constantine placed his hands on his son's head to impart the public blessing, Alexander suddenly recoiled. His face contorted in horror, a flash of revulsion impossible to hide. The patriarch quickly disguised the scene as an act of princely humility. But the most observant dignitaries understood that they had witnessed a fracture far too evident. The heir prince was no longer Byzantium's jewel, but a young man marked by trauma that was beginning to overflow. And what was brewing inside him was not resignation, it was a dark fire that would soon transform him from victim into avenger. That night, after the public humiliation at the Theophany ceremony, Alexander realized he could no longer endure in silence. What had until then been a hidden torment began to take root as a fixed idea: resist, fight, take revenge. The young heir turned to what he knew best: books. In the palace's secret archives, he began studying cases of regicide in Byzantine history. He analyzed how Phocas had eliminated Maurice, how Basil I had assassinated Michael, and how John Simosk's had ended Nicephor too. In each case, he sought not only inspiration but also a legal and theological justification for what he was beginning to plan. The conclusion he reached was clear: an emperor who had broken the most sacred commandments, who had dishonored the purest bond, had lost all divine legitimacy. In the eyes of God and history, his father was no longer an emperor, but a tyrant. And a tyrant, in Byzantium, could and should be removed. At the same time, Alexander began carefully observing those around him. He identified officials unhappy with the emperor's instability, aristocrats who feared for their privileges, and even clergy who saw Constantine as a danger to the church's morality. Gradually, he began weaving a silent network of sympathizers and potential allies. He was no longer the trembling boy who avoided his father's gaze. Now, in the silence of his room, Alexandro repeated to himself that he had been born not only to inherit a crown, but to restore the dignity of his lineage. His suffering had transformed into a weapon. And Byzantium was about to witness a victim become a conspirator. Alexandro's plan required more than sheer will, it needed allies. And in the complex machinery of the Byzantine court, alliances were as lethal as swords. The first to join was George Palaiologos, a veteran general who had served faithfully under Constantine X. He had witnessed the emperor's violent outbursts up close and feared that his instability would jeopardize the empire's security. When Alexandro confided part of his suffering to him, Palaiologos swore loyalty without hesitation. For him, supporting the prince was not treason, but saving Byzantium. Next came Stephen Lecapinos, captain of the Varangian Guard. The Varangians, those towering Nordic warriors famed for their loyalty to the emperor, seemed impossible to sway. But Alexandro, with his natural charisma, achieved the unthinkable. He convinced the captain that his duty was not to a corrupt man, but to the legitimate continuity of the empire. Lecapinos agreed, on the condition that his men would be protected during the transition. The third ally proved decisive: Michael Cerularius, nephew of the Patriarch of Constantinople. He was a learned and ambitious cleric who, upon hearing Alexandro's testimony, did not hesitate to give it a moral framework. An emperor who violates divine law loses the grace of God, he declared. His presence ensured something vital: the church could bless what, in the eyes of history, would be regicide. The conspirators' meetings were held in the Church of the Holy Apostles, under the guise of devotion. The location was no accident: emperors were buried there, and convening in this sacred space reinforced the idea that what they planned was not murder, but a purification of the throne. Alexandro gradually revealed the horrors he had endured. His testimony was so harrowing that even the hardest hearts fell silent. Palaiologos would later write, "I have seen horrors in war, but nothing compares to what that young man endured in his own home." Thus the conspiracy was born, a mixture of personal pain, religious justification, and political calculation. And everyone knew the timing had to be perfect. One mistake would not only mean Alexandro's death, but the doom of the entire empire. The chosen date was symbolic: January 1st, 1074, the feast of Saint Basil, the reformer who had fought clerical corruption. A fitting day for an act meant to purify the imperial throne. Constantine X followed his nightly prayer routine in his private chambers. It was the moment when he was most vulnerable, isolated even from his guards. What had been a scene of abuse for years would that night become a stage for justice. Alexandro entered silently. He carried no ordinary weapon. In his hands was the ceremonial spada of Justinian I, the emperor who had dreamed of restoring the glory of Rome. The message was clear: what was about to happen was not a vulgar assassination, but an act charged with historical legitimacy. The confrontation was immediate. Alexandro, in a firm voice, accused his father of the crimes he had committed against him and against the dignity of the crown. The emperor, surprised, first tried to laugh off the accusations, then clumsily denied them, and finally begged. But it was too late. The prince, after years of silence, had attained absolute coldness. "You are no longer my father, nor the emperor," he allegedly said, according to Paleologos. "You are the shame of the empire. And in the name of God and justice, your reign ends here." The blow was precise. The sword pierced Constantine X's heart, ending his life within seconds. In the palace silence, the metallic echo of the weapon blended with the distant chants of the city's festivities. To the people, the emperor was still alive. But in reality, Byzantium had changed forever that night. The conspirators acted quickly. The death was officially presented as a sudden illness. And while the eunuchs announced mourning, Alexandro was proclaimed the new emperor. Byzantium had a young ruler, but also a prince marked by the blood of his own father. The morning after the regicide, Constantinople awoke to solemn bells and hushed rumors. The official announcement was clear: Emperor Constantine X had died suddenly of a swift illness. The court accepted it without question, perhaps because most had long preferred to ignore the whispers in the corridors of the great palace. Alexandro was proclaimed emperor with the backing of the Senate, the army, and the church. To everyone's eyes, the Ducas dynasty remained intact, and the throne had passed from father to son naturally. But those who knew the truth understood that it was not a succession, but a purification of power. His reign lasted barely 4 years, but it was marked by a profound shift in the understanding of imperial authority. Alexandro implemented legal reforms that strengthened protections against the abuse of power within the royal family and the aristocracy. Under his rule, regulations limited private audiences between emperors and heirs, and the role of eunuchs as guardians of palace privacy was reinforced. To the public, these were administrative reforms. But to those who knew his story, they were scars turned into law. However, behind these measures, Alexandro never escaped his inner demons. Chroniclers describe him as an emperor of contrasts: active, energetic, and reform-minded during certain periods, and deeply melancholic and withdrawn at others. His character was marked by tragedy. He had carried out his revenge, but he had not found peace. In the year 1078, at the age of 25, he died suddenly. The official version spoke of fever. Others claimed he was poisoned by political rivals who feared his secrets would be revealed. Whatever the truth, his life remains one of the most tragic in Byzantine history, the story of the prince who became emperor through the blood of his own father. The story of Alexandro Ducas is not just that of a son who avenged his father's abuses. It is a blueprint of what happens when absolute power corrupts even the most sacred bonds: family, faith, the crown. Constantine X, chosen by God according to Byzantine ceremonial, used his authority not to protect, but to destroy. And Alexandro, made a victim from his adolescence, transformed his pain into an act of justice that elevated him to the throne, but also condemned him to carry a wound that never healed. His brief reign left its mark on the laws and memory of the empire. But his deepest legacy is not in reforms, but in the warning he sends across the centuries: unlimited power always breeds monsters, and when these monsters arise within the institutions themselves, the consequences are not confined to one family, they can engulf an entire empire. Today, more than 1,000 years later, his story remains an uncomfortable mirror. It forces us to ask, what happens when human dignity is sacrificed in the name of power? Can personal justice truly heal the wounds of injustice, or does it only open new scars? If this story impacted you as much as it should, share this video so more people can discover the dark side of the Byzantine Empire. And leave me a comment with your thoughts. Do you think Alexandro was a hero for taking revenge, or a victim who could never free himself from his own destiny?